Well, Dr. Nolan, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I'm really excited to spend a little bit of time talking about a topic that we just don't talk about enough, and that topic is grief. Why don't we just jump in and have you share a little bit about how you got interested in the topic of grief?
Yeah, great question. My interest in grief primarily grew out of both personal experience and professional experience. Personally, I witnessed a trauma in 2013, and that kind of changed my whole world in an instant. And I've seen throughout my time with people who've been grieving that grief can largely go unacknowledged, and
Mm,
many people do not talk about it. So it can definitely have a toll on people's health. It
yeah.
shapes their relationships, and it can, like, just like with me, it can shape their sense of meaning. So, as a public health researcher and grief counselor myself, I just try as best as I can to help as many individuals who are navigating profound losses that don't have the language or the support to process it.
Hmm.
And to me, grief is not a private matter. It's something that must be shared and must be acknowledged publicly. And therefore, because we are all grievers, I feel that grief is a public health issue, and it
Hmm.
definitely affects our communities, our healthcare system, and oftentimes in deep, invisible ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I feel like with grief, there's always this kind of misconception about grief, right? Like people are going to be sad for X period of time or they're going to process it in a certain kind of way. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those misconceptions are from your lens?
Yeah, there's several misconceptions. The biggest is probably what, just as you have said, that grief follows a predictable timeline, that people should just be over it in a few months or so. In reality, grief is not linear.
Mm-hmm.
Is such thing that people kind of twirl around called the stages of grief. There are no such things as stages of grief. Grief comes in waves, and those waves don't always shrink with time. And
Yeah.
another myth is that grief only follows death. And in truth, we grieve many kinds of losses: divorce, job loss, illness, identity is a huge one, or
Mhm.
even loss of dreams and hopes and expectations. And then there's also another misconception that I commonly see where that talking about grief openly somehow will make it worse
Mm.
or, draw attention to yourself. And in
Yeah.
fact, naming it can often be the first step of healing. And by talking about one's grief out loud, typically individuals who are there to support can help and step in a greater way, but they don't know how to step in if they don't know that you're grieving or that you're working through something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm really glad that you had talked about it's more than just death, right? Because I know
Absolutely.
as someone who has lost a job, right? Like had a job rescinded, that definitely was a period of grief. And I didn't know it at the time, but now that I'm a little, wiser and more mature, recognize that that's what it was. I know other folks have things that they've lost that they've been looking forward to or excited about. And so I'm glad that you hit on that because that to me is like normalizing that piece is really important
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely, absolutely. And that identity grief piece is really crucial as well. If you've been in a relationship for 15, 20 years and you identify as a we and that relationship ends, suddenly you have to go from the we to the me. So
Yeah.
whether it's job loss, like you said, even pet loss is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now, Rachel, you have shared with me that there's a difference between pathological and normal grief. Can you share a little bit of what those differences are with my listeners?
Yes, and it's a very, very important distinction. Normal grief is a healthy, albeit painful response to a loss of any kind. Again, that could be pet loss, loss of dreams, identity, you name it. It includes sadness, yearning, and disruption of one's life. But over time, people begin to find meaning, they adjust and reintegrate the loss into their lives. So there's really no like completely getting over it or completely healing. You just reintegrate the loss into your life, you find meaning from it, and then you move forward. Pathological grief, on the other hand, is often associated with what's called prolonged grief disorder. Now, this is a more persistent and impairing type of grief. It can include intense emotional pain, difficulty accepting the loss, or a sense of meaningless that doesn't ease over time. So while normal grief softens and adapts, and typically we see this about the 6 to 9 month period
Mm.
after a loss, When someone is experiencing pathological grief, they remain stuck in that feeling. And oftentimes they may benefit from clinical intervention.
Hmm. Now, if somebody is, a friend of mine or a family member of mine, and we think that maybe they're entering into this pathological grief, what are some of those maybe signs, that we may need to encourage them to get some different kind of help?
So some signs that I personally look for are, again, if they're stuck. If you are about that 6 to 9 month period and it doesn't seem like that person is adapting or that they haven't taken any steps to actively mourn or integrate that loss into their life, that would be a red flag. Some other red flags to look for is if the person, the loss itself is such an impairing time in their life that after a period of time, they're just not able to do like normal things, like normal ADLs, brushing their teeth, going to work. Like they're having a very difficult time even doing those basic functionings after what we would consider like that normal period. Because there's always shock initially.
Sure.
People just have to go through the motions. But again, after that 6 to 9 month period, if you are with a loved one or a friend or a family member and they're just not able to, keep up with, their daily responsibilities. It's impacting their life in ways unimaginable, still to a point that it's like harming them or harming their relationships. That would be a time for me to kind of call a timeout and see what we can do, what we can, as far as from a community level and a friend level, to wrap around that person and help them kind of navigate their loss and what they're dealing with.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thank you for that. Now, I was at a conference recently and we were discussing, the speaker was discussing a little bit about grief and had shared that we as humans just don't talk about it, right? Like it's kind of this icky thing. It almost feels taboo to talk about. And so I'm curious, why is it important for women specifically to be talking about the topic of grief?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So socially, women often serve as sort of the emotional anchors in families and communities. And that's just from history. Women have primarily been the caretakers of children, etc.
Mhm.
So they are expected to kind of grieve in silence or stay strong for others, whether those are little kids or whether those are younger children or other family members or neighbors. So talking about grief helps us dismantle any of those unrealistic expectations and allows women to open up more authentically in their relationships, their caregiving, and their leadership, which is something that we learn together through our leadership programming.
Yeah.
Now, when women themselves talk about grief, typically they do talk about it more openly.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, women tend to seek out support more often than some of their counterparts.
Sure.
And in doing so, they create and open up more spaces for vulnerability, storytelling, and healing. And those conversations over time can help challenge that cultural silence that keeps grief in the shadows, which ultimately helps us all. So, regardless
Mhm.
of gender, by women themselves kind of paving the way and leading that way for their children and their families, we as a society can learn to grieve more honestly and more openly, which is really what we should be doing, because honestly, that's where we were 100 years ago. The Death Society 100 years ago was more open of
Mm.
grief. It was a community event. It was a very highly respected and sensitive time in an individual's life. And nowadays, it's just like, grief is something, again, that we must not talk about and quickly get over. Oh, and by the way, go back to work in 3 to 5 days and act like everything's normal.
Right, right, right. I'm a big believer in showing my sad emotions. Right. And early in life and early in my career, women shouldn't cry at work. And crying has a place, a time and place at work. And so I know that I have had folks come up to me and say, thank you for doing that. Thank you for being open and vulnerable. And so it's not easy, right? So all the things
So
that you're talking about and kind of being vulnerable and open is important. And so I just want to acknowledge for my listeners, like, right, Rachel's sharing some really incredibly powerful things, and it's not easy. So don't think that it may not come easily to you, right? To be vulnerable and forward facing. But as a mom to two little human girls, it's important to me as well to, be the role model
Absolutely.
for little girls on what that looks like. It's okay to cry. Period.
Absolutely.
End of story.
Absolutely.
So,
And same on the other side. I have two young men that I'm
yep.
a parent to, and modeling to them, how I grieve openly helps them to grieve more openly,
Yep.
and hopefully, they'll model that to their children and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, you've shared a ton of tips already throughout this episode, but I'm curious if you have some additional tips for my listeners who maybe they're dealing with some grief themselves, or maybe they're helping someone work through some grief. What tips would you give to them?
Yeah, so first, there is no right or wrong way to grieve, and
Mhm.
no two people grieve the same. We've shown this time and time again with identical twins in the same household who have experienced the same loss. From a neurobiological or physiological level, grief manifests differently in their bodies. So when you say things like, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel," that's not true because there is no way to know exactly how somebody else feels,
Yeah.
just like there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And something that might come up for me that you don't think necessarily is quote unquote a big deal, based on my relationship with the circumstance, it might really be a big deal to me. So
Sure.
I would say no judging either would be a really good way to kind of think about it. Don't judge yourself and
Hmm.
don't judge others. And
Hmm.
give yourself permission to feel what you feel. Try not to isolate yourself. I mean, there was one time where I was in the middle of a Toys R Us store, and I walked by, I was getting a baby shower gift, and this wave of grief just came over me. And I remember I had to lean on to like a crib and compose myself
Hmm.
and just allow that emotion to wash through me.
Hmm.
And then remember, grief wants to be witnessed. Grief doesn't want to sit inside us because the longer it sits inside of us and it's not dealt with, it can turn pathological over time. So whether it's a friend, a support group, a therapist, like me, or just anyone, connection is key. Sometimes, just even talking to a random stranger can be really helpful. I mean, it's happened to me in airports, or when
Yeah.
I get on a plane next to someone, I'll tell them that I'm a grief therapist, and they'll either open up completely, and the next 2 hours of the flight go by really fast, or they kind of just immediately like, oh, I want to talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're supporting someone else, I would definitely urge you to not think of things to fix or minimize,
Mm-hmm.
but rather than that, just like say things like "I'm here with you," or and I would avoid those euphemisms like "they're in a better place" or
Mm.
"I've mentioned I know how you feel." Because while those may be true, based on your faith or your religion, you might believe if, after a death, somebody's in a better place.
Yep.
That doesn't help the griever. The griever
Yeah.
wants them here now.
Yeah.
So those euphemisms are not something that I suggest that we practice. And remember, like offering things like practical support is really helpful.
Mm.
And try not to say things like, well, let me know what you need, because oftentimes grievers don't know what they need.
Sure.
Grievers are so heart struck and they're so in a place of just a lot of emotion to even think about like they haven't eaten in the last couple days is like not something that they're consciously aware of. So
Hmm.
doing practical things like just saying, I'm going to the grocery store, I'm picking up some staples, and I'm dropping them off tomorrow at 5 p.m. on your front porch. Or you probably haven't eaten anything, so I'm door dashing you some pizza for this evening.
Hmm.
Those little things like that, they can speak volumes when words feel inadequate. And
Hmm.
I've had people come up to me saying, oh gosh, I just don't know what to say. That's perfectly okay.
Hmm.
Say that.
Yeah.
Say, I don't know what to say right now, but I know that I love you and I'm here for you. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
words are very powerful.
Yeah, those are some really great tips. I know I have felt similar in that, I don't know what to say, so I avoid it. So those are really great tips in terms of either, hey, I'm not sure what to say, but I love you, and I'm thinking of you, right? Like, and I've heard and seen some folks talk about like, I'm gonna DoorDash for you, or I'm gonna come take all your trash out of your house, or
Yes.
those kinds of things. So. Those are great tips, and I'm sure my listeners probably have some rolling around in their head as well. So, Well, Rachel, this has been really eye-opening for me, and I appreciate your expertise on this topic. As we kind of wrap up our episode, I'm curious, what final thoughts do you have for my listeners?
Yeah, so I always say that like grief and love are two sides of the same coin. And oftentimes in society, we view like grief as a sign of weakness. And to me, grief is not a sign of weakness. It's like a superpower because it's a sign of love. The extent to which we grieve is the extent to which we love. So if I have somebody that comes into my private practice and their grief is just really, really powerful, that to me is a testament to how much they loved that person
Yeah.
or that circumstance, if you will. So if you're grieving, you're not broken. You're human. There's nothing wrong with you. It may feel like at times you're going crazy, but I assure you you're not. And we live in a culture that often wants to rush our healing. Take a pill, call the doctor. All you need is to get in another relationship or you get another dog or any of those things to hurry that up. But healing takes time, it
Hmm.
takes space, and it
Hmm.
takes support. So I would encourage the grievers to give themselves and other grievers grace. And if you're holding space for someone who is grieving, even if it's yourself, thank you. And I really, really mean that from the bottom of my heart because there are often times where people don't have anyone to turn to. So if you are grieving yourself or you're providing that support, thank you from the bottom of my heart because you're helping to change the way we relate to loss. And just like with this podcast, we're helping to change the way we relate to loss one conversation at a time. So that's what I would say.
Rachel, this has been really great. Like I said, I appreciate you sharing your experiences and your expertise on the topic. And I know, as you know, as a listener of the podcast, that it's important for us to be talking about things that we're not, and this feeling of only to lonely, right?
Right.
And so I think this is a great topic for hopefully my folks who are listening who might be feeling like an only right now are realizing that they're not an only and that they're not lonely out there with the topic of grief. So
Yep.
thanks for joining me, Rachel.
Thank you.
Yeah. And friends, thank you for joining me for another episode. And hopefully you also took some really important nuggets away from Dr. Nolan as I did on this topic of grief. And we're going to jump right into our affirmations. I'm done apologizing for spending time focused on me. I'm done apologizing for allowing grief to wash over me. And this one's for you. I'm done apologizing for fill in the blank. Friends, go out there, have an incredible week, do the amazing things I know you're capable of. Remember to like, follow, and share wherever you're listening to this podcast episode. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button, what are you doing? Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you know exactly when the next episode comes out. I'm on social media everywhere you can find me I can be found at Done Apologizing over on LinkedIn, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. You name it, you can probably find me out there on the social media platforms. And if you want to be a guest, just like Rachel and all my other incredible guests, make sure you fill out the form at the link in my show notes or on any of my social media platforms. And remember, you're fabulous. You're a badass. You've got this, and I'm here for you.